In the scorching desert near Tanis, 650 years before Christ, the finest builders in all of Egypt vanished without a trace. Not in battle, not from plague, not even from the frequent political upheavals that plagued the late period. They simply disappeared after completing the most secretive construction project in the kingdom's dying days. For generations, their families searched the length of the Nile, from Memphis to Aswan, but found nothing. No bodies, no belongings, no answers. What the families never knew was that their loved ones lay buried just 30 feet beneath the very stones they had laid with their own hands, sealed alive in a tomb of their own making. The truth of their fate would remain hidden for over 2 millennia, a testament to both human greed and the deadly price of knowing too much in a kingdom where dynasties rose and fell like the desert wind. Before we uncover the terrifying truth of what happened to these master craftsmen, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on more journeys into ancient Egypt's darkest secrets. The story we're about to tell reveals how even the most skilled hands could not build their way out of the tomb that became their final masterpiece. The year was 648 before Christ, and Egypt was a shadow of its former glory. The once mighty kingdom that had dominated the ancient world for 3,000 years now found itself fractured between competing dynasties, each claiming divine right to the throne of the pharaohs. In the north, the Site dynasty struggled to maintain control from their capital at Sais, while in the south, Nubian rulers still held sway over Upper Egypt. Between them, lesser nobles and ambitious generals carved out their own kingdoms, turning the land of the pyramids into a patchwork of warring states. It was in this chaos that Khaem Waset, a master builder whose grandfather had worked on the great temples of Thebes, received the most lucrative commission of his career. The messenger who approached him in the crowded marketplace of Tanis wore no identifying marks, no royal seals, no symbols of any recognized dynasty. He was a thin man with nervous eyes who spoke in whispers and paid in pure gold, more than Khaem Waset had seen in 5 years of honest work. The commission was simple in its description, but complex in its implications. Build a secure underground chamber, 40 cubits long by 20 cubits wide, accessible only through a hidden entrance, and completed in absolute secrecy. No questions would be asked, no records kept, and no workers could be used except those personally vouched for by Khaem Waset himself. The gold up front was enough to feed his family for 2 years. The promise of payment upon completion would make him wealthy beyond his dreams. Khaem Waset chose his team carefully. There was Amenhotep, a stonemason whose steady hands could cut granite blocks so precisely they fit together without mortar. Seneb, a carpenter who understood timber and bronze better than any craftsman in the Delta. Horus, whose knowledge of drainage and waterproofing had saved a dozen projects from the annual floods. Ptahmos, an artist whose hieroglyphic inscriptions were sought after by nobles throughout the kingdom. And finally, young Keti, barely 20, but already showing the architectural genius that might one day surpass even Khaem Waset's own reputation. The location chosen for their work was a desolate stretch of desert 15 miles southwest of Tanis, where ancient ruins provided convenient cover for their activities. Here, the remains of a forgotten temple complex offered both concealment and readily available building materials. The mysterious patron had specifically requested that they work only during the darkest hours of night, when the desert cold made labor bearable and curious eyes were least likely to witness their progress. For 6 weeks, the 6 craftsmen labored under star-filled skies, their work illuminated only by carefully shielded oil lamps. They carved through solid limestone, hauled away tons of debris, and constructed what was unmistakably a burial chamber of extraordinary richness. The walls were lined with polished granite blocks, each one fitted with mathematical precision. Bronze reinforcements supported the ceiling, while hidden channels would drain any moisture that might threaten the chamber's contents. Most telling of all, Thutmose was ordered to inscribe specific prayers for the protection of royal treasures, along with warnings against disturbing the sacred contents. As the work progressed, the builders began to understand what they were truly constructing. This was no ordinary tomb for a deceased noble, but rather a hiding place for the wealth of a fallen dynasty. Gold fittings designed to hold treasure chests, ventilation shafts that would preserve precious scrolls and fabrics, and most damning of all, a secret entrance mechanism that could only be operated from the outside. They were building a vault that could imprison anyone unlucky enough to be inside when the entrance was sealed. The implications sent chills through the small crew that had nothing to do with the desert cold. Somewhere in Egypt's turbulent political landscape, a defeated ruler needed a place to hide the accumulated wealth of his bloodline, secure from both grave robbers and rival claimants to his throne. And these 6 men now knew exactly where that treasure would be hidden. The completion of their work coincided with news that sent tremors throughout the Delta region. Psamtik, the powerful pharaoh of the Site dynasty, had finally crushed the last significant resistance in Upper Egypt, unifying the kingdom under his rule after years of civil war. Towns throughout the Nile Valley buzzed with rumors of defeated nobles fleeing north toward the Mediterranean, their followers scattered and their treasuries emptied in desperate attempts to fund continued resistance. It was on the night they installed the final bronze fitting that Khaemweset made the decision that would seal his fate and that of his companions. As they emerged from the completed chamber through the cleverly disguised entrance, wiping limestone dust from their hands and tools, he gathered his 5 companions around a small fire built from dried reeds. "Brothers," he began, his voice barely audible above the desert wind, "we have built something magnificent, a treasure vault that could hide the wealth of pharaohs for 1,000 years. But we are the only living souls who know its location and its secrets." Amenhotep, ever practical in his thinking, immediately grasped the implications. "The patron who hired us will not want witnesses to his transaction. Men who can lead others to hidden treasure are dangerous men to keep alive." Young Keti, whose architectural training included the study of royal burial practices, added his own disturbing observation. "The entrance mechanism we installed can only be operated from outside. Anyone inside, when it's sealed, would have no way to escape. We built a tomb, not just a vault." The 6 men sat in uncomfortable silence, each wrestling with the same realization. Their anonymous employer had commissioned them to build their own death trap. Once the treasure was installed and secured, the builders themselves would become the final security measure, their silence guaranteed not by gold, but by suffocation in the chamber they had crafted with such skill. It was Horus who spoke the thought that had formed in all their minds. "We could demand more payment. Much more. The secret of this location is worth far more than any amount of gold initially offered to us." Seneb, older and more cautious than the others, shook his head vigorously. "Blackmail against unknown patrons in times like these is suicide. We don't even know which faction hired us, or what resources they have for eliminating problems." But Khaemweset had already made his choice. Fear and greed warred in his heart, and greed proved stronger. "We know something worth a fortune, the location of a royal treasure vault, built to our own specifications, in a kingdom where gold can buy armies. We would be fools not to capitalize on our knowledge." Patamos, whose artistic sensibilities often provided unexpected wisdom, raised a different concern. "What if our patron is not the one hiding treasure, but someone seeking to steal it? What if we have been hired by grave robbers who plan to use this chamber as a staging ground for raids on legitimate tombs?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke, adding another layer of danger to their situation. In the chaotic political climate of the late period, distinguishing between legitimate rulers and ambitious thieves was often impossible. They could be working for a rightful pharaoh protecting his heritage, or for bandits planning the greatest heist in Egyptian history. Despite these uncertainties, or perhaps because of them, Khaemweset convinced his companions to join him in what he termed renegotiating their contract. They would demand payment not just for their construction work, but for their ongoing silence about the vault's location. If their patron refused, they would offer their knowledge to competing bidders. In a land where dynasties paid fortunes for information about their rivals' hidden resources, the builders held a valuable commodity. The plan was simple. When their mysterious employer arrived for the final inspection of the completed chamber, they would present him with their new terms. Additional payment equal to 10 times their original commission, delivered in gold and silver, or they would publicize the vault's location to every competing faction in Egypt. They had built the perfect hiding place, and now they would profit from both its construction and its secrecy. 3 nights later, as they waited in the pre-dawn darkness beside their creation, the builders felt confident in their position. The entrance to the chamber was disguised so cleverly that even they sometimes had difficulty locating it in the dim light. The interior was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry, worthy of housing the treasures of pharaohs. And most importantly, they were the only people alive who understood how to access the vault once it was sealed. What they failed to consider was that their patron had been planning for this possibility from the very beginning. The excessive payment, the demand for secrecy, the careful selection of workers with no political connections, all of it had been designed to create the exact situation that was now unfolding. The builders thought they were blackmailing their employer, but in reality, they were walking voluntarily into the trap that had been set for them 6 weeks earlier. When the mysterious messenger finally appeared, emerging from the pre-dawn shadows with a dozen armed companions, Caimhwasset felt his first real stirring of fear, but it was too late for second thoughts. The game had begun, and there would be no winners among the builders. The confrontation began with deceptive courtesy. The thin messenger who had first approached Caimhwasset in the marketplace of Tanis stepped forward, his nervous demeanor replaced by cold calculation. Behind him, 12 men in dark clothing formed a loose semicircle, their hands resting casually on bronze daggers and short swords. In the dim starlight, their faces were invisible, but their intentions were unmistakably hostile. "Master Builders," the messenger began, his voice carrying a note of false appreciation, "your work exceeds even our highest expectations. The chamber you have constructed will serve its purpose admirably. However, we understand that you have additional terms to discuss regarding your compensation." Caimhwasset stepped forward, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the obvious danger surrounding them. "Our original agreement did not account for the true nature of this project. We have built a royal treasure vault, not a simple storage chamber. Our silence regarding its location is worth considerably more than the gold initially offered." The messenger smiled, an expression devoid of warmth in the desert darkness. "Indeed, your silence is valuable beyond measure, so valuable, in fact, that we have prepared a special payment that will ensure your discretion for all eternity." It was Amenhotep who first understood the implications of these words. The mason's practical mind had always served him well, and now it provided a moment of clarity that came too late to save anyone. "They never intended to let us live," he whispered to his companions. "The chamber we built is our own tomb." The messenger's smile widened. "Your architectural skills are matched only by your intelligence, Master Mason. Yes, you have indeed constructed your own final resting place, and what a magnificent tomb it is, worthy of the master craftsman who will spend eternity within its walls." Horus, whose expertise with waterproofing had made him acutely aware of the chamber's design flaws from a prisoner's perspective, spoke with growing desperation. "The ventilation system will not support human life for more than a few hours. You mean to seal us alive inside our own creation? The irony is quite beautiful, is it not?" The messenger replied. "The finest builders in Egypt, entombed forever in their own masterpiece. Your skills will be remembered in the stones you laid, your artistry preserved in the hieroglyphs you carved, and your silence guaranteed by the very chamber you constructed with such precision." Young Keti, whose architectural genius had contributed to the vault's most sophisticated features, made a desperate attempt to bargain. "The treasure you plan to hide. We know nothing about its origin or its rightful owner. Our blackmail was born of fear, not greed. Release us, and we will disappear into the southern deserts. No one will ever learn of this place from our lips." The messenger shook his head slowly. "Your fear proves your intelligence, young architect. You understand exactly how dangerous this knowledge is. That is precisely why you cannot be allowed to leave this place alive." Seneb, the carpenter whose bronze fittings would soon secure their tomb, spoke with the bitter wisdom of age. "Who are you? Which dynasty do you serve? At least grant us the knowledge of who we die for." For the first time, the messenger's composure cracked slightly. "We serve Egypt itself, old craftsman. Not any single dynasty or ambitious pharaoh, but the eternal kingdom that transcends the petty squabbles of mortal rulers. The treasure that will rest in your chamber represents the accumulated wealth of 3 dynasties, hidden here until Egypt finds peace and unity once more." Tammuz, whose artistic soul had always sought deeper meaning in the work of his hands, understood the tragic irony of their situation. "You have used us to build a time capsule, a vault to preserve Egypt's wealth through the chaos of civil war, to be recovered when the kingdom is whole again. And we are to be the guardians of that treasure, watching over it in death as we never could have in life." "Precisely," the messenger confirmed. "Your bodies will rest alongside the greatest treasures of 3 royal bloodlines. Pharaohs will envy your burial, for you will lie in state with riches beyond the dreams of kings." The armed men began to close their circle, but Caimoset made one final attempt to change their fate. The chamber's entrance mechanism requires knowledge that died with the original architect. Without our guidance, you may never be able to reopen the vault when the time comes to recover the treasure. The messenger produced a rolled papyrus from beneath his dark robes. Your assistant, young Katie, was quite thorough in his documentation. Every detail of the entrance mechanism, every measurement of the chamber, every aspect of the construction process. We have no need of living witnesses when we possess such comprehensive records. Katie's face went pale as he realized his own meticulous record-keeping had doomed them all. His architectural training, which demanded precise documentation of every project, had provided their captors with everything needed to operate the vault without its builders. As the first grey light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, the 6 master builders found themselves being herded toward the entrance of their own creation. Behind them, the armed guards carried the tools and materials needed to seal the chamber permanently, once its human contents were secured inside. The desert wind picked up, scattering sand across the ancient ruins and erasing the footprints that marked the location of their secret project. Soon even the physical evidence of their work would be hidden beneath the shifting dunes, leaving only the buried chamber as testament to their skill and their fate. As the 6 builders were forced through the concealed entrance of their own creation, the true scope of their captors' planning became devastatingly clear. The chamber they had built with such pride and skill was already partially filled with wooden crates and bronze chests, their contents hidden beneath layers of protective linen wrapping. These were not empty containers waiting for treasure to be deposited, but rather the actual wealth of the defeated dynasties, already moved to its final hiding place, while the builders worked unknowingly to complete their own tomb. Caimoset ran his hands along the familiar walls, feeling the smooth granite blocks he had personally selected and positioned. The chamber measured exactly 40 cubits by 20, just as specified in their original commission, but seeing it filled with treasure chests made the space feel cramped and oppressive. Bronze-reinforced cedar boxes lined the walls, while larger containers of ebony and ivory occupied the center of the room. Even in the flickering light of oil lamps, the accumulated wealth was staggering in its scope. 3 royal treasuries, the messenger explained as he descended into the chamber behind his prisoners. Everything that could be salvaged from the palaces of Tanis, Ses, and Thebes as the armies of unification swept across Egypt. Gold from Nubian mines, silver from Lebanese mountains, ivory from the southern lands beyond the cataracts, jewelry that adorned queens, weapons that armed pharaohs, and scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of 30 centuries. Amenhotep, ever practical even in the face of death, examined the moisture control systems he had installed throughout the chamber. The drainage channels will preserve these materials for generations, perhaps centuries. You have created the perfect time capsule for Egypt's golden age. Young Katie, his architectural mind still working despite their desperate situation, noticed something that sent a chill through his bones. The ventilation system I designed was never intended to support human life for extended periods. The air shafts are too narrow, the circulation too limited. We will suffocate long before we starve or die of thirst. The messenger nodded approvingly. Your professional competence serves our purposes admirably. Death will come quickly and quietly, without prolonged suffering. Consider it a mercy that few condemned men receive in these troubled times. Horus, whose waterproofing expertise had made the chamber secure against flood and moisture, realized another horrifying detail. The bronze seals we installed in the entrance mechanism cannot be opened from inside. We designed this chamber to be absolutely secure against intrusion, which means it is equally secure against escape. As if summoned by this observation, the sound of heavy wooden beams being moved into position echoed from the entrance passage above. The armed guards were installing the final barriers that would seal the chamber permanently, using the very materials the builders had prepared for this purpose. Each beam fell into place with a hollow thud that seemed to echo in their chests, marking another step toward their inevitable suffocation. Seneb, whose carpentry skills had created many of the chamber's most sophisticated features, made a desperate exploration of their prison. He examined every joint, every fitting, every surface that might offer hope of escape. But his own craftsmanship worked against him at every turn. The walls were solid stone, the ceiling supported by bronze beams that would require a dozen men to move, and the floor laid over bedrock that would take months to excavate, even with proper tools. "We built this chamber to last for eternity," he said quietly to his companions. "Every technique we used, every precaution we took, every innovation we incorporated, all of it now serves to guarantee our imprisonment." Thamos, whose artistic talents had created the hieroglyphic inscriptions throughout the chamber, read aloud the prayers and warnings he had carved into the walls at their captor's request. The irony was bitter beyond words. He had inscribed blessings for the protection of treasure and curses against those who would disturb the sacred contents, never realizing that he was writing his own death sentence in ancient symbols. "May the gods protect what lies herein from the hands of thieves and tomb robbers," he recited from his own work. "May those who violate this sacred place find only death and eternal punishment. May the guardians of this treasure rest in peace among the riches they protect." The messenger, now preparing to depart and seal them forever, offered one final revelation that transformed their understanding of the entire conspiracy. "You have wondered about our identity and our loyalties. The truth is both simpler and more complex than you imagined. We serve no single pharaoh or dynasty, but rather the continuity of Egypt itself. We are the keepers of the Sacred Trust, an organization that has preserved royal treasures through every period of chaos and civil war for over 800 years. Khaemwaset felt his world shifting as this information sank in. "You are not grave robbers or political opportunists. You are the guardians of Egypt's heritage, preserving the kingdom's wealth for future generations of legitimate rulers." Precisely. When Egypt achieves true unity once more, when a pharaoh worthy of the ancient crown emerges to restore order and justice, these treasures will be recovered and returned to their rightful place in royal palaces and sacred temples. Until that time, they must remain hidden from the ambitious and the corrupt, who would use them to fund their own grab for power. The sound of stone blocks being moved into position above their heads indicated that the sealing process was nearly complete. Soon the chamber would be invisible from the surface, disguised so perfectly that even deliberate searches would be unlikely to locate it. The 6 builders would disappear as completely as if they had never existed, taking their knowledge of the vault's location to graves that would never be found. As the oil lamps began to flicker and fade, conserving their precious supply of air, the builders faced the final hours of their lives surrounded by wealth beyond imagination. Gold that could have ransomed kingdoms, silver that could have built cities, and jewels that could have adorned gods themselves. They were the richest dead men in all of Egypt, and the poorest living ones who had ever drawn breath in the shadow of the pyramids. The last sound they heard from the world above was the scraping of sand being spread over the concealed entrance, erasing all evidence of their burial place and ensuring that their tomb would remain undisturbed until the end of time itself. In the absolute darkness that followed the extinction of their final lamp, the 6 builders confronted the reality of their situation with the methodical precision that had made them masters of their crafts. They had perhaps 6 hours of breathable air remaining, assuming their calculations about the chamber's volume and ventilation were accurate. 6 hours to come to terms with their fate, to search for any possibility of escape, and to decide how they would spend their final moments on Earth. Khaemwaset, as the leader who had made the fatal decision to blackmail their captors, felt the weight of responsibility crushing down upon him more heavily than the tons of stone and sand now sealing them in their tomb. In the pitch darkness, he could hear his companions breathing, each inhalation slightly more labored than the last, as the oxygen in their prison gradually depleted. "I brought us to this end," he said quietly, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "My greed and my fear made me believe we could bargain with forces beyond our understanding. You followed me into damnation, and I can never atone for that betrayal." Amenhotep's response came from somewhere to his left, near the eastern wall, where the largest treasure chests were stored. "We all made the choice, Master Builder. Each of us could have refused to participate in the blackmail, could have insisted on accepting our original payment and disappearing into the southern deserts. We stayed because we all saw the same opportunity for wealth and power. Young Keti, whose architectural genius had contributed so much to their current predicament, was methodically exploring the chamber's dimensions with his hands, searching for any flaw in their construction that might offer hope of escape. His fingers traced the joints between stone blocks, tested the bronze fittings they had installed with such precision, and measured the spacing of the air shafts that were proving so inadequate for human survival. "The irony is perfect in its completeness," he reported to the others. Every innovation we incorporated, every improvement we made over traditional tomb construction serves to make our prison more secure. We didn't just build a treasure vault, we built the most escape-proof chamber in all of Egypt. Horus had positioned himself near the concealed entrance, where his knowledge of the sealing mechanism offered their only theoretical chance of freedom. But theory and practice were proving to be very different things in the darkness of their tomb. The bronze controls that operated the entrance could be manipulated from inside the chamber, but the wooden beams and stone blocks placed above them by their captors had made the mechanism inoperable. "I can feel the bronze levers that should open our way to freedom," he reported with growing frustration. "But the weight pressing down on them is beyond our ability to move. We would need a dozen men with proper leverage to shift the barriers above us." Seneb, whose carpentry expertise included knowledge of structural engineering, was examining the ceiling supports with growing desperation. The bronze beams that held up tons of stone and sand were anchored so securely that removing them would require specialized tools and considerable time, luxuries they did not possess in their rapidly depleting atmosphere. "The supports could theoretically be weakened," he admitted reluctantly, "but collapsing the ceiling would crush us long before it created an opening large enough to escape through. We built this chamber to survive earthquakes and floods. It will certainly survive our desperate attempts to destroy it from within." Thamos had found a different focus for his final hours. Using a bronze stylus he had kept with his tools, he was scratching additional inscriptions into the stone walls, creating a record of their fate that might someday be discovered by tomb robbers or archaeologists. In the darkness, he worked by touch alone, his artistic training guiding his hand as he carved their story into the very walls that imprisoned them. "Future generations will know how we died," he said, his stylus scraping steadily against the stone. "They will understand that master craftsmen built their own tomb, and that greed led skilled hands to carve their own epitaphs. Perhaps our fate will serve as a warning to others who might be tempted by similar opportunities." As the hours passed and their breathing became increasingly difficult, the builders began to experience the psychological effects of oxygen deprivation. Thoughts became confused and disjointed, conversations trailed off into silence, and the boundary between wakefulness and sleep grew increasingly blurred. In this twilight state between life and death, memories of their past achievements mingled with hallucinations of escape routes that existed only in their failing minds. Khemwaset found himself reliving the construction of his first major project, a mastaba tomb for a wealthy merchant in Memphis. He remembered the pride he had felt when the perfect alignment of the stone blocks, the satisfaction of creating something that would last for centuries, the respect he had earned from clients and competitors alike. Now, his final masterpiece would indeed last for centuries, but as a monument to his own greed, rather than his architectural skill. Amenhotep's thoughts turned to his family, a wife and 3 children who would never learn what had happened to him. They would wait for his return from this mysterious and lucrative commission, wondering why he had not sent word or returned home as promised. Eventually, they would assume he had died in an accident or been killed by bandits, never suspecting that he lay buried beneath the desert in a chamber filled with royal treasures. The sound of their increasingly labored breathing filled the darkness, each inhalation more precious than gold, each exhalation bringing them closer to their final moment. The air in their tomb was becoming thick and stale, depleted of the life-giving elements their bodies desperately needed. Soon, they would begin to lose consciousness, sliding gradually into the eternal sleep that would claim them all. It was Kiti who spoke the thought that had been growing in all their minds as the end approached. "We are about to join the ranks of Egypt's greatest mysteries. Master builders who vanished without explanation, their fate unknown, their skills lost forever. Future archaeologists will puzzle over our disappearance the way we have wondered about the lost architects of the Great Pyramid." In the absolute darkness of their tomb, surrounded by treasures worth more than entire cities, the 6 master craftsmen prepared to take their final breaths in the chamber that would serve as both their monument and their grave. In their final hour, as consciousness flickered like dying flames in the oxygen-starved chamber, the builders made their peace with death in ways that reflected the skills and passions that had defined their lives. The treasure surrounding them, worth more than the combined wealth of minor kingdoms, had become irrelevant in the face of their approaching mortality. Gold could not purchase breath, silver could not buy freedom, and jewels could not illuminate the path to salvation. Khemwaset, his mind growing cloudy from lack of air, used his remaining strength to examine one final aspect of their tomb that had been troubling him since their entombment began. The mathematical precision of the chamber's dimensions, the careful positioning of the treasure chests, and the specific arrangement of the air shafts all followed patterns that suggested a deeper purpose beyond simple storage. "Brothers," he wheezed, his voice barely audible in the stifling atmosphere, "this chamber was not designed merely to hold treasure. Look at the positioning of the chests, the alignment of the walls, the orientation of the entrance. We have built something that serves as both vault and temple, both hiding place and shrine." Amenhotep, summoning the last of his mason's analytical skills, felt along the walls they had constructed with such pride. His trained hands detected subtle variations in the stonework that had escaped his notice during construction. Certain blocks were carved with symbols so faint they could only be perceived by touch, creating a pattern that extended throughout the entire chamber. The inscriptions Ptahmos carved were not random decorations, he realized with dawning comprehension. They form a complete ritual text, designed to consecrate this space as a sacred repository. We have not just hidden treasure, we have created a temple to preserve Egypt's divine heritage through the chaos of civil war. As the air grew thinner and their vision began to fade, Ptahmos made a startling discovery among the treasure chests nearest to the eastern wall. His artist's eye, trained to notice details that others might miss, detected something unusual about one particular container. Unlike the others, which were sealed with standard bronze clasps, this chest bore the personal cartouche of Psamtik himself, the very pharaoh who had recently unified Egypt under Site rule. "This treasure does not belong to defeated dynasties," he gasped, his words barely audible as he struggled for breath. "Some of these items are recent additions, taken from the current royal treasury. We are not just hiding the wealth of the past, we are preserving the future of Egyptian kingship itself." Young Keti, his architectural genius functioning even as his body began to shut down from oxygen starvation, pieced together the final elements of their captor's true plan. The chamber's sophisticated ventilation system, the precise drainage channels, the careful temperature control, all of it was designed to preserve not just physical treasures, but the sacred essence of Egyptian kingship itself. "The scrolls among the treasures are not merely administrative records," he gasped, his words coming in short bursts between increasingly difficult breaths. "They contain the true names of the gods, the secret rituals of coronation, the divine formulas that transform mortal men into living pharaohs. This chamber holds the spiritual foundation of Egyptian civilization." Horus, whose expertise with waterproofing had made him acutely aware of every detail of the chamber's environmental controls, discovered something that changed their understanding of their captor's ultimate plan. Hidden beneath layers of protective wrapping in the largest chest, he found not gold or silver, but a collection of sacred oils and unguents used in the most secret pharaonic ceremonies, substances that would remain potent for centuries if properly preserved. "We have become the guardians of Egypt's soul," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the thick, stale air. "Our deaths ensure the preservation of everything that makes Egypt eternal. The keepers of the sacred trust chose us not just for our skills, but for our willingness to die protecting what we helped to hide." Seneb, whose carpentry had created many of the chamber's most crucial features, felt a strange peace settling over him as he realized the true honor of their fate. Master craftsmen throughout Egyptian history had dreamed of creating works that would outlast their mortal lives. Now they had achieved immortality of a different kind, becoming eternal sentinels over the most precious treasures in the kingdom. "Our families will grieve our disappearance," he said softly, "but our names will be remembered in the secret histories of those who preserve Egypt's heritage. We are not victims of treachery. We are chosen guardians, selected for the greatest responsibility any craftsman could receive." In their final moments of clarity, the builders experienced something that defied rational explanation. As their consciousness faded and the physical world grew distant, they seemed to sense the presence of something beyond their dying bodies. Whether it was the accumulated spiritual power of the sacred objects surrounding them, or simply the hallucinations of oxygen-starved minds, each man felt a profound connection to the eternal essence of Egypt itself. Kayamwaset saw visions of future pharaohs who would one day recover these treasures, using them to restore Egypt to greatness after centuries of foreign domination. Amenhotep felt the satisfaction of stones perfectly placed, knowing that his craftsmanship would preserve these sacred objects until the end of time. Katie experienced the architect's ultimate achievement, a structure so perfectly conceived that it would fulfill its purpose for millennia beyond his own lifetime. Petamos, his artistic soul finding beauty even in their tragic circumstances, spent his final conscious moments adding one last inscription to the chamber walls. Working by touch alone in the absolute darkness, he carved a message that summarized their transformation from hired workers to sacred guardians. Here rest the builder priests of the hidden temple, who gave their lives to preserve the divine essence of Egypt until the kingdom shall rise again in glory. As their breathing became increasingly shallow and their consciousness began to fade, the 6 builders experienced visions that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of their dying bodies. In these final moments, they saw Egypt as it had been in its greatest days, united under powerful pharaohs, protected by the gods, blessed with prosperity and peace. They saw the treasures they guarded being recovered by a worthy ruler who would restore the kingdom to its former glory, using the sacred objects and ritual texts to legitimize his divine authority. The mathematical precision of their chamber's construction had created acoustic properties that amplified even the faintest sounds. In their final moments, the builders could hear something that should have been impossible: the distant sound of desert wind moving across the concealed entrance far above their heads. The sound seemed to whisper promises of eventual discovery, of their treasure vault being opened by hands worthy of its contents, of their sacrifice being recognized and honored by future generations. Khaemhotep was the last to lose consciousness. His final thoughts focused not on regret for the greed that had led them to this fate, but on pride in the masterpiece they had created. The chamber that served as their tomb was indeed their finest work, a structure so perfectly conceived and executed that it would preserve Egypt's most precious heritage for centuries or even millennia to come. As the master builder's breathing finally ceased, the chamber fell silent, except for the almost inaudible whisper of air moving through the ventilation shafts they had designed with such care. The 6 guardians had taken their posts for eternity, their bodies resting among treasures beyond imagination, their sacrifice ensuring the survival of Egyptian civilization through its darkest hour. In the absolute darkness of their tomb, surrounded by the wealth of pharaohs and the sacred symbols of divine kingship, the master builders had achieved a form of immortality that even the greatest pharaohs might envy. The desert sands shifted over the concealed entrance, erasing all traces of the master builder's final project from the surface world. Within days, the seasonal winds had completely obscured the location of their tomb, creating natural camouflage that would protect their secret for centuries to come. The ancient ruins that had provided cover for their construction work gradually crumbled further under the relentless assault of sand and time, until even the memory of human activity in that desolate place faded from local knowledge. The families of the 6 builders waited months for word from their missing loved ones, searching the length of the Nile from Memphis to Aswan. Khaemhotep's wife questioned every merchant and traveler who passed through Tanis, hoping for news of the mysterious commission that had taken her husband into the western desert. Katie's aged father consulted priests and fortune-tellers, seeking divine guidance about his son's fate. Amenhotep's 3 children grew to adulthood, never knowing what had become of their father, carrying only the memory of a skilled craftsman who had left home one morning and never returned. But no answers came, no bodies were found, and eventually the families were forced to accept that their men had simply vanished into the chaos that plagued Egypt during those turbulent years. The official records of Tanis made no mention of their disappearance, and no witnesses came forward to describe the mysterious project that had claimed their lives. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed 6 of Egypt's finest craftsmen without leaving so much as a footprint to mark their passing. The keepers of the sacred trust, true to their ancient mission, carefully documented the location of the hidden chamber in their secret archives. But they recorded it in code, using symbols and references that would be meaningless to anyone outside their organization. The coordinates were described in terms of astronomical alignments, seasonal wind patterns, and the positions of landmarks that might themselves disappear over time. Only the most senior members of the organization possessed the knowledge needed to decode these cryptic references. The 6 builders had become part of a conspiracy that stretched back centuries, their sacrifice joining a long tradition of anonymous guardians who had died protecting Egypt's heritage through times of war and political upheaval. Their names were entered into the organization's most sacred registry, not as victims or criminals, but as martyrs who had willingly accepted death to preserve the divine essence of Egyptian kingship. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The late period gave way to Persian conquest, then Ptolemaic rule, then Roman domination. Each foreign occupation brought new threats to Egypt's cultural treasures, and each time the keepers worked in shadows to preserve what could be saved. But the location of the builder's tomb, with its precious cargo of 3 dynasties' worth of royal treasure, remained hidden even from most members of the secret organization. The chamber they built remained exactly as they had left it, sealed, protected, and perfectly preserved. The ventilation system they had designed continued to function for decades after their deaths, slowly cycling air through the hidden vault and maintaining the precise environmental conditions needed to preserve scrolls, fabrics, and organic materials. Their waterproofing prevented moisture damage during the rare desert floods. Their drainage channels carried away any seepage that threatened the chamber's contents, and their mathematical precision ensured that the structure remained stable despite the shifting sands above. Inside the tomb, the bodies of the 6 master builders gradually mummified in the dry desert air, their remains becoming as preserved as any pharaoh who had been prepared for eternity with expensive embalming techniques. They lay among treasures that included golden crowns worn by 3 different dynasties, silver vessels used in the most sacred temple ceremonies, ivory carvings that had adorned royal palaces, and papyrus scrolls containing religious texts that had been ancient when the pyramids were built. The builders had achieved a form of immortality that surpassed even their wildest dreams of earthly success. They had become eternal guardians of Egypt's soul, their bodies watching over the physical symbols of divine kingship that would someday restore legitimacy to a reunified kingdom. In death, they had gained an honor that living pharaohs might envy, the privilege of protecting Egypt itself through its darkest hours. As centuries turned to millennia, the political landscape of Egypt changed beyond recognition. The Roman Empire collapsed, Arab conquerors brought new religions and languages, and the ancient knowledge of hieroglyphic writing was lost to all but a few scholars. The secret organization that had commissioned the builder's tomb adapted and survived through these transformations, but the knowledge of specific treasure locations gradually became more fragmentary. Wars, plagues, and political upheavals claimed the lives of keepers who carried crucial information in their memories. Some hiding places were discovered and looted by grave robbers. Others were lost forever when their guardians died without passing on their secrets. The tomb of the 6 builders joined the ranks of Egypt's greatest mysteries, a treasure vault whose location was known only to the dead, guarded by men who had paid the ultimate price for their architectural excellence. Their story became legend among the few who knew it, passed down through generations of secret guardians as both inspiration and warning. It reminded each new generation of keepers that protecting Egypt's heritage required sacrifices that ordinary men could not comprehend, and that true immortality came not from personal glory, but from service to something greater than oneself. The tale of the master builders who had been buried alive beneath their own stones became a sacred text within the organization, read aloud during initiation ceremonies and remembered in prayers for the honored dead. Modern archaeologists, working with increasingly sophisticated technology, occasionally detected anomalies in the desert near Tanis that suggested the presence of undiscovered chambers beneath the sand. But the keepers' ancestors had chosen their hiding place too well. Ground-penetrating radar found hints of voids in the bedrock, but never quite enough to justify the massive excavation that would be required to reach them. Satellite imaging revealed subtle patterns in vegetation growth that might indicate buried structures, but the evidence remained tantalizingly inconclusive. In the end, the 6 builders had achieved exactly what they had spent their lives pursuing. They had created a masterpiece that would last forever, a work of such perfection that it would preserve the most precious treasures of Egyptian civilization until the end of time itself. They had built their own monument, carved their own epitaphs, and chosen their own form of eternal glory. The chamber that had begun as their death trap had become their pathway to immortality, transforming 6 ambitious craftsmen into the greatest guardians Egypt had ever known. And in the absolute silence of their hidden tomb, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of pharaohs and the sacred implements of divine kingship. They continued their watch over the kingdom they had loved enough to die protecting. Their sacrifice ensured that somewhere in Egypt's future, when the kingdom found peace and unity once more, the sacred treasures of divine kingship would be recovered and restored to their rightful place in the hands of a worthy pharaoh. Until that distant day, the builders would remain at their posts, as faithful in death as they had been skilled in life, guardians of Egypt's eternal soul, buried alive beneath the stones they had laid with their own hands. Tell me in the comments what you think about the fate of these master builders. Were they victims of treachery, or heroes who achieved the greatest honor any craftsman could receive? And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories from ancient Egypt's most mysterious chapters, where the line between legend and history disappears beneath the desert sands.